Brewing tea with an Yixing clay teapot is an extremely rewarding experience. Yixing clay has this amazing property of actually absorbing the color, flavor, and luster of whatever teas you brew in it. So if you choose a kind of tea, a pu'er for example, over time, the teapot is going to start to give back depth and complexity of pu'er to anything that you brew in the pot. It's telling a story from the first tea you made in it all the way to the present. So there are a few things you need to take care of when you're using Yixing clay teapots. When you get a new one, they need to be seasoned. And that's what I'm going to show you how to do today, seasoning an Yixing clay teapot. When they're brand new, they're often pretty dull. This one I've actually started using a little bit. I couldn't wait. It's a really nice teapot for show pu'er I just got from a friend in China. But you can see a newer teapot can be sort of dull or sort of too shiny. So we're actually gonna boil the teapot. That's what I've got this pot of boiling water here for. We're gonna get all of the sediment that might be trapped in the pores of the unglazed clay out, and then I'll show you how to put the pot in, take it out, dry it, and then season it using tea. Few tools you need. Clean pot. Make sure it's really, really clean. If it's got any food, smells, or crust in it, that's gonna be the first thing your Yixing clay teapot absorbs, and then your tea is gonna taste like last night's spaghetti. Tongs. These can be useful, so you have to actually get the clay into the water. I personally like to use one of these things, which is great for deep frying, but I recommend having one that you don't use for cooking because otherwise the oil residue on it actually gets into the pot. So this one has only been put into water for Yixing clay. So I've got clean filtered water in here at a really slow boil. If it's really intensely boiling, it's going to sort of rattle the teapot at the bottom. Take the cover off. So we put this teapot onto the strainer. And you have to be very careful at this stage. You sort of lower it in, and what you're going to have to do is lower it in at a little bit of an angle, because you have to get the water to fill up the teapot, otherwise it sort of floats. So if you have to use a tongs, I'm just going to use my fingers because I've held a lot of boiling water objects, so it doesn't bother me. But you can use a tongs as well to sort of push it down, get the water flowing in there. And I would leave it resting on a spoon like this. It's going to make it a lot easier to get off when you're done boiling it. It's also going to stop it from rattling on the bottom of a pot if you're at a really heavy boil. So while that's going, I have the top part. If you're impatient, you can do them at the same time, or you can do them separately for your first Yixing clay teapot that you boil and season. So I'm just going to put it in sort of along the side here, and that'll be fine. And I can move it around a little bit with this wooden tongs, or if you have some extra spoons like this, you could also sort of rest it in a spoon. And you want to leave these boiling for a few minutes. I generally recommend 5 to 10 minutes is enough time to get most of the sediment out. So after your pot has been in the water for a few minutes, 5 to 10 minutes, it's time to take it out and sort of shift it around. It's easiest to just lift it out if you've got one of these useful strainers, or of course you can use the tongs. Notice that when you're lifting it out of the water, there is boiling hot water in the pot. You're going to have to either let it cool for a minute or use a hot pad and pour the water out like that. And then if you're not quite sure, take a look at the inside of the pot. Some pots come with a lot more sediment than others, so you'll see if there's a bunch of dust in there, just dip it a few more times. Do the old kind of tilt it down, get the water in, swish it around, and pour it out again. So when you're satisfied that it looks really clean, there's not a lot of dust or sediment, it looks shinier. As the teapot heats up, a good clay is going to get nice and shiny. I don't know if you noticed this, but it actually is more lustrous hot than it was dry. We're going to carefully put it on a towel to dry. Before you do any seasoning on the pot, it has to be dried completely. So if you have the lid separate and you haven't boiled it yet, make sure that you get that in there too. You'd let that sit for maybe 3 to 4 minutes. It's just a little piece, so it'll be alright. Just make sure it doesn't rattle around in the bottom again. And when that's ready, you're going to take that out and put it on the towel. And we're just going to let those dry. Generally, at this heat, it only takes about 2 minutes for the teapot to dry completely. And when you don't see any more water, then it's time to season the pot and brew it. So, when your teapot is dry and ready, we're actually going to season the pot. And essentially the reason you season a teapot is because it's greedy when it starts out. It absorbs a lot of the flavors that you put in it. If you were to just start brewing tea, a good teapot would take almost all of the flavor right out of the tea for the first few uses. Seasoning actually lets some tea soak into the pores of the clay and make sure that you get to actually enjoy your tea when you drink it out of the pot. You're going to need a bowl that's big enough to completely submerge the teapot. Don't need any tongs anymore. And then choose a tea that you want to brew. If you're going to use an Yixing clay teapot, I do recommend that you choose a certain genre of tea, a certain type. This teapot is for chaud pour. For me, that's specific enough. Some people like to do one just for musty old chaud pour and one for really sweet chaud pour, one for example for oolongs. You might have one for shui xian big red robe, one for shui jing gui big red robe, but you really don't need that unless you just want to go crazy and you need an excuse to collect 30, 40, 50 Yixing clay teapots. One for darker things, one for lighter things is fine. So, what we're going to do is take the chaud pour, and I'm actually using the 2004 tea trail to season this pot. Put in a lot of tea. You're not going to be drinking this, you just want it to be nice and strong. So, normally I'd only do about 5 grams, this time I'm doing more like 9 grams of tea. And then we're going to steep it. And some people say just pour the water in and let it sit, but if you've ever done that and you forget about tea in a teapot for 20 minutes, it does get bitter, and bitterness will impart the flavor into the teapot. So we're actually going to steep it as if we're actually brewing tea, but we're, instead of pouring it into cups or a pitcher, pouring it right into a big bowl. So doing 10-15 seconds. You don't necessarily need to do a wash when you're doing a steeping for seasoning a teapot. And essentially I'm just going to keep pouring water into this pot until I fill the bowl up enough to submerge the pot completely. And then I'm going to take the leaves out of the pot and just put the pot right in the bowl and let it sit until the tea cools back to room temperature. And when it's cool, we will take the teapot out of the tea, dry it, and it'll be ready for your first use. Just don't be surprised if you got a really nice Yixing clay teapot, if even after seasoning, it's stealing a lot of flavor. I've been using this teapot now for a few months. I've used it quite a few dozen times and it's still making pretty light tea. Over time it's going to get darker and it's going to start giving a lot back. But that'll take a while. Yixing pots are sort of a lifetime enterprise. They're like pets. You can think of them as little pet rocks, but without the googly eyes, usually. Although some Yixing clay teapots have googly eyes too. And over time the teapot will grow, it'll mature, it'll get more lustrous, it'll go through stages of being really shiny and beautiful, and then suddenly it's going to get dull and we'll think, oh no, what's going on? My teapot's in its moody teenage years. But then it'll break out of that, it'll be a beautiful teapot again. They go through these weird plateaus, so you'll get to know your pot really well. I chose a big bowl, so this is going to be probably about 10 full pots of tea in here. This is probably just about enough. So when you filled your bowl with enough tea, you actually have to take the leaves out of your Yixing clay teapot, which I've done here. If you leave the leaves inside the pot, they're actually going to keep steeping and the tea is going to get bitter, and then you'll be seasoning your pot with a bitter tea. But when you've got a nice empty pot, just put it right in the bowl. Let it fill up with tea leaves and gently set it on the bottom there. Same thing with the cover, make sure that it gets in. This might be a time if you have to use your tongs. You can see that it's actually sort of welled up and we haven't gotten water all the way inside. So you can kind of twist it around, and when you're satisfied that you've got enough tea in there, you're just going to let it sit for a while. I would use a good tea to season a teapot. Some people say just use anything, use something cheap. A really good Yixing clay teapot is a lifetime investment. I would recommend using your favorite tea of a genre. And it seems like a waste. You're wasting a whole session that you could brew, but it's not a waste. You're feeding it to the teapot. It's a sacrifice that's going to pay off later, an investment. So we'll let that sit, and after the water cools, we can take it out, let it dry, and you're good to go.